Everything can change the instant you genuinely stop caring. Many people assume that when an emotionally distant person pulls away, the story has reached its final page. They see the silence as proof that the connection is finished. They assume the other person has moved forward and will never look back. It sounds reasonable. It feels definite. But human attachment is rarely that simple. For some people who struggle with emotional closeness, the moment you truly stop pursuing them can actually trigger one final emotional reaction. And that reaction can catch you completely by surprise. It can bring hope back. It can create confusion. It can even reopen wounds you thought had finally healed. The hardest part is that this reaction may appear precisely when you are beginning to feel free. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop wondering whether another message will arrive. You stop analyzing every small detail. Your days become calmer. Your mind becomes quieter. Then, suddenly, they appear again. A message arrives. They react to something you posted. They ask a random question. They bring up an old memory. Maybe it is nothing more than a simple hello. At first, it feels meaningful. It feels like they finally understand what they lost. It feels as though everything you once hoped for is finally coming back. But sometimes, the real reason is much more complicated. One of the biggest misunderstandings about emotionally avoidant behavior is assuming that distance automatically means there are no feelings. That idea is repeated constantly, but attachment psychology presents a far more complicated picture. Emotional distance does not always equal emotional detachment. Someone can avoid intimacy while still experiencing strong emotions underneath. They may struggle to understand those emotions, express them, or tolerate them. And this is where people often get caught. They confuse emotional movement with emotional maturity. Those are completely different things. A person can contact you without becoming emotionally available. They can miss you without being prepared for a healthy relationship. They can fear losing you without knowing how to genuinely keep you. The difference may look tiny from the outside, but it can completely change the outcome. Many people who rely on distancing behaviors use protective habits to reduce emotional discomfort. These habits can help them feel independent, safe, and in control when intimacy becomes overwhelming. Often, these reactions are not carefully planned. They can happen automatically. They may have developed over many years through earlier experiences where closeness felt unpredictable, uncomfortable, or unsafe. This is why someone can look perfectly calm while experiencing emotional tension internally. They can appear unaffected while still noticing what you are doing. They can create distance while secretly wanting reassurance that you have not completely disappeared. Most people never see this because they focus only on the silence. The silence becomes the whole explanation. But silence is not always the complete story. Sometimes it is only one part of a much larger emotional process. And that process can begin when your attention finally disappears. Think about what often happens in this type of relationship. One person gradually gives more time, more energy, and more emotional effort. The other person gradually steps farther away. One reaches out, the other retreats. Then the first person tries harder. The second person pulls back again. Eventually, this pattern becomes so familiar that both people start treating it as normal. But then something changes. The chasing ends. Not because you are trying to manipulate them, not because you want to create jealousy, not because you are secretly waiting for them to react. It ends because something inside you has finally shifted. You accept what is happening. You choose peace instead of anxiety. You stop trying to prove that you are worthy of being chosen. You stop waiting for another person to give you the certainty you could not give yourself. And that is the moment the emotional balance can suddenly change. The person who once felt certain that you would always be there is no longer sure. The predictable pattern disappears. The reassurance they may have quietly relied upon is suddenly gone. For some people, that uncertainty can become deeply uncomfortable. Stay with me, because this is where the situation becomes much more interesting. This is also where people often reach the wrong conclusion. They assume the distant person has finally realized that they are completely in love. Sometimes that may happen, but it is not always the explanation. In some situations, the stronger emotion is the fear of losing control over the connection. That may sound uncomfortable, but it becomes easier to understand when you look at attachment patterns. Predictability can create a sense of safety. Knowing that someone remains emotionally available can feel reassuring, even for someone who struggles with intimacy. When that certainty suddenly disappears, older fears can become active again. The reaction may even confuse the person experiencing it. They may not understand why they suddenly feel restless. They might tell themselves they are only checking in. They may say they want closure. They might convince themselves that the message is simply friendly. But underneath those explanations, something else may be happening. Their emotional system is responding to a change in the relationship dynamic. They did not necessarily become a completely different person overnight. The circumstances simply changed, and that difference matters. This hidden process helps explain a question that confuses so many people. Why does someone sometimes come back after weeks or even months of silence? Why do they seem interested again when you finally look happy without them? Why do they suddenly appear after previously acting as though your presence meant very little? People have endless explanations for this. Friends give their theories. Social media gives quick answers. Some call it manipulation. Others call it fate. But human behavior is usually more complicated than either label. Attachment is influenced by needs that people may not consciously recognize. Fear can look like indifference. Distance can cover vulnerability. Silence can hide emotional conflict. And renewed attention can happen without representing genuine long-term commitment. That is why understanding this pattern matters. The goal is not to condemn emotionally distant people or label them as bad. The goal is to understand behavior clearly enough that you no longer lose yourself inside it. Once you understand the pattern, confusion begins to lose its power. You stop blaming yourself for every withdrawal. You stop analyzing every sentence for a hidden message. You stop assuming that every unexpected return means a new beginning. Instead, you begin asking stronger questions. Has anything actually changed? Are the actions different, or are only the words different? Is there consistency? Is there accountability? Is there a willingness to communicate openly? Or is the old pattern quietly starting again? These questions can protect your peace more than any prediction ever could. Throughout this video, we are going deeper into why this final emotional reaction can happen, what may be taking place underneath the surface, and why intelligent, emotionally aware people can still mistake it for genuine transformation. You will also discover several lesser-known psychological patterns that can make this stage feel even more confusing than the original separation. Once you understand them, situations that once seemed mysterious may suddenly become much easier to recognize. And by the end, you may look at your previous relationship experiences through an entirely different lens. More importantly, you will have a clearer way to protect yourself from falling back into a cycle that can repeat quietly for months or even years. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy discovering the hidden psychology behind relationships, attachment patterns, emotional behavior, and human connection, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next video. Now let us examine one of the most misunderstood reactions that can happen when you finally stop caring, and why recognizing it could completely change the way you interpret your past relationships. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that emotionally avoidant behavior means the person does not care at all. It sounds straightforward, but human emotions rarely follow such a simple formula. Some emotionally distant people can experience extremely strong feelings. The difference is not necessarily how much they feel. The difference is what they do when those feelings become intense. For someone who relies heavily on emotional distance, closeness can create pressure instead of comfort. Intimacy can activate an internal warning system rather than a feeling of safety. The closer another person gets, the stronger that internal alarm may become. Suddenly, what should feel comforting can feel overwhelming. A simple conversation can feel like pressure. Emotional vulnerability can feel like losing independence. A request for reassurance can feel like a demand. So the person retreats. They create space. They become quieter. They may appear colder than before. From the outside, this can look like a lack of emotion, but internally, the experience may be far more complicated. These reactions often have roots that reach back much further than the current relationship. Long before adulthood, people can develop beliefs about closeness, dependence, trust, and emotional safety. Those beliefs can later influence how they respond when someone genuinely begins to matter. And once you understand that, the behavior starts looking very different. Many attachment experts suggest that these emotional patterns can begin during childhood, especially when emotional needs were ignored, criticized, or answered inconsistently. Over time, the mind can absorb a powerful message. Relying on other people does not feel completely safe. As people grow older, that lesson does not simply vanish. Instead, it can become an automatic protective strategy. Someone who tends to avoid emotional closeness may genuinely enjoy being around another person. They may miss them when they are gone. They may even develop very deep feelings for them. Yet when the relationship becomes more emotionally intense, another part of their mind may begin looking for an escape route. This creates behavior that can seem incredibly confusing from the outside. One moment they are warm, affectionate, and engaged. The next, they become quiet, distant, or difficult to reach. Many people immediately assume they have stopped caring. But sometimes the person is actually trying to lower the uncomfortable emotions that intimacy has triggered inside them. That does not mean everyone with avoidant tendencies behaves identically. Attachment patterns exist along a wide spectrum. Personality, personal history, emotional maturity, self-awareness, and willingness to grow can all influence how someone responds. Some people communicate clearly when they need space. Others disappear without giving an explanation. Some recognize their patterns and work hard to create healthier relationships. Others repeat the same painful behavior for years without understanding why. So this is not about placing every emotionally distant person into one box. It is about recognizing patterns that appear often enough to deserve attention. And one of the most important patterns appears when the sense of emotional control begins to shift. Control is a word that can easily be misunderstood here. It does not always mean controlling another person. More often it means controlling uncomfortable emotions. A person who struggles with intimacy may feel safer when they can decide exactly how close the relationship becomes. They may feel more secure when they can step away before emotions become overwhelming. Having the ability to create distance can temporarily lower their anxiety, even if they never consciously explain it that way. But relationships are constantly changing. Nothing remains perfectly predictable forever. And when the other person genuinely stops pursuing them, something unexpected may happen. The emotional balance changes. The person who once seemed permanently available no longer feels guaranteed. The reassurance created by predictability begins to fade. For someone whose protective system depends on keeping emotional distance on their own terms, this sudden uncertainty can quietly awaken fear. This is where many people draw the wrong conclusion. They assume the emotionally distant person has suddenly experienced a huge realization and finally understands everything they lost. Sometimes that can happen, but often the process is much more subtle. They may simply be responding to uncertainty. Attachment systems can become activated when emotional security feels threatened. For an anxious person, that threat may be created by distance. For an avoidant person, it may be created by vulnerability or the feeling that they are losing control over the emotional situation. But when someone important begins to disappear completely, even a protective distancing system can react in unexpected ways. Suddenly, the person may become more curious, more attentive, more interested in what you are doing. They may appear more present than they were before. That does not automatically mean every fear has disappeared. It does not necessarily mean they are suddenly prepared for lasting intimacy. Sometimes the return is simply an unconscious attempt to restore a sense of emotional balance. And this is why the reaction can be so convincing. What many people call the final emotional move is often misunderstood as a deliberate strategy. In reality, it may not be carefully planned at all. It can be a defensive reaction happening below conscious awareness. The person may sincerely believe they are simply checking in, saying hello, or reconnecting casually. They may have no idea why they suddenly feel compelled to make contact. They might not recognize the deeper emotional forces influencing their behavior. Understanding this hidden process is important because it explains why the return can feel so powerful and why it is so easy to mistake renewed attention for genuine transformation. Now think about the pursuer and distancer cycle. This is one of the most common patterns seen in relationships, where one person strongly values emotional distance. It usually develops so gradually that neither person notices what is happening at first. In the beginning, everything may feel balanced. Conversations are natural. Affection feels sincere. Both people appear equally interested. Then, slowly, the distance begins. One person starts reaching out more often, while the other begins stepping back. The more one person searches for closeness, the more the other person searches for space. Then the cycle feeds itself. Every attempt to reconnect can feel like pressure to one person. Every withdrawal creates uncertainty for the other. Without realizing it, both people begin activating each other's deepest fears. The person pursuing connection experiences silence as a warning. The person creating distance experiences closeness as pressure. And suddenly the relationship becomes a constant reaction to fear, even though neither person may ever say that out loud. Here is something many people do not realize. Emotionally distant people do not necessarily dislike attention. Some may actually enjoy knowing that someone cares deeply about them. That attention can provide a quiet form of reassurance. It tells them the connection still exists whenever they feel ready to engage. As long as the other person continues texting, checking in, apologizing, explaining, or trying to repair everything, the emotionally distant person may never have to wonder whether they still matter. The relationship remains available. The connection feels secure from a comfortable distance. Ironically, this can allow them to maintain their space because someone else is carrying much of the emotional work required to keep the bond alive. Most people do not notice this hidden arrangement. They assume the distant person is completely detached and has stopped paying attention. But complete emotional disconnection can look very different. Some people continue watching quietly. They notice changes. They remember details. They may observe from a distance far more than anyone realizes. Their silence does not automatically prove that they stopped caring. Sometimes silence is simply the method they use to regulate emotions they do not know how to process directly. Another surprising part of this pattern is the sense of control created by emotional distance. Again, this is not necessarily about dominating someone else. It is about reducing internal discomfort. As closeness increases, vulnerability increases. As vulnerability rises, anxiety may follow. Creating space can then lower that anxiety. That is why one person can appear completely calm while the other feels emotionally exhausted. From the outside, it looks as if one person cares deeply and the other feels absolutely nothing. But internally, the experience can be much more complicated. The distant person may look stable simply because they have created enough space to calm themselves. Meanwhile, the pursuing person can spend every day dealing with uncertainty. They wait for replies. They replay conversations. They examine short messages for hidden meanings. They wonder whether a change in tone means something important. Their emotional energy becomes focused on restoring the connection. And this is where uncertainty becomes extremely powerful. The human brain does not enjoy unanswered questions. When something remains unresolved, the mind keeps returning to it, searching for an explanation. Inconsistent attention can therefore create a stronger emotional fixation than predictable affection. Think about that for a moment, because this explains why some relationships become so difficult to leave. When attention appears and disappears, the mind becomes more invested in finding the next moment of connection. The less available the distant person becomes, the harder the other person may try. The harder they try, the more comfortable the distant person may feel maintaining space. One person pursues, the other retreats. One becomes more anxious, the other becomes more withdrawn, and the cycle can continue for weeks, months, or even years. But eventually, something changes. The messages stop. The emotional pursuit disappears. The repeated apologies end. The constant reassurance is gone. The person who always fought to keep the relationship alive finally steps away. That single shift can disrupt the emotional balance the other person had quietly become accustomed to. Suddenly, The certainty they once relied upon is no longer there. And with that certainty comes an emotion they may not have expected to experience. But here is the real turning point. The biggest change does not happen when you stop sending messages. It happens when your emotional well-being finally stops depending on whether they respond. That is when the entire relationship dynamic begins to transform. There is a massive difference between acting like you have moved on and actually reaching a place of emotional peace. Many people stop sending messages while secretly hoping the other person will notice. They still check their phone. They still replay old conversations. They still wonder what every silence means. Their attention may have stopped moving outward, but internally, it remains tied to the relationship. Real emotional detachment looks completely different. Your everyday life becomes important again. Your attention returns to your goals, your routines, your friends, and your own future. Your happiness no longer rises and falls because of one notification. You stop trying to translate every silence into a hidden message. You stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to continue living. And ironically, this may be the exact moment when an emotionally distant person begins sensing that something has changed. Human beings are far more sensitive to patterns than they realize. When someone who is always available suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable, the difference becomes noticeable. The familiar rhythm disappears. The old pattern is no longer operating in the background. The emotional certainty that may have existed for months or even years is suddenly gone. For someone who relied on that certainty more than they consciously realized, this shift can feel strangely unsettling. Many people assume that once an avoidant person pulls away, they completely stop paying attention. But attachment research suggests that emotionally distant people can still monitor relationships in subtle ways. They may notice that you communicate less. They may recognize that your energy has changed. They may realize that you no longer respond with the same urgency, concern, or emotional intensity. And that realization can create discomfort. Not necessarily because they suddenly developed overwhelming romantic feelings, but because something familiar has disappeared. The relationship no longer feels predictable, and predictability plays a much larger role in emotional attachment than most people understand. The human mind naturally searches for familiar patterns. Once a pattern becomes established, even an unhealthy one can begin to feel strangely safe simply because it is known. For an emotionally avoidant person, that familiar pattern may have looked like this. They create distance, you move closer. They become quiet, you reach out. They take longer to respond, you wait. They pull away, you try to understand. Over time, both people can begin unconsciously expecting the same roles. Then one day, the entire script changes. You stop chasing. You stop demanding explanations. You stop trying to repair every period of silence. You stop proving that you still care. Suddenly, the other person cannot predict what you will do next. That uncertainty can activate their attachment system in ways they never expected. This is one of the least discussed parts of avoidant behavior. Many people believe that only anxious partners become emotionally activated when a relationship feels uncertain. But emotionally avoidant people can also become activated when their usual sense of emotional stability starts slipping. And again, control here does not necessarily mean power over someone else. It can simply mean emotional stability. As long as the person believed the relationship would remain available whenever they eventually wanted to reconnect, their nervous system could remain relatively calm. But when that certainty disappears, new questions can quietly appear. Are you really gone? Have you finally moved forward? Did someone else become important to you? Will this connection disappear completely? They may never say these thoughts aloud. They may not even fully recognize them in their own mind. Yet those questions can still influence what they do next. And this is exactly where people often misinterpret the situation. They assume the distant person has finally realized how deeply they love them. Sometimes genuine love is certainly part of the story, but love is not always the strongest force operating in that particular moment. Sometimes, the stronger reaction is simply the loss of emotional predictability.